we are recording this, and and if you've got any questions, down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little chat feature. So make sure when you've got a question, you type that in. Eric Dolin has been to Falmouth before. You might recall Eric's written several books, including, and Eric usually does maritime history, environmental history. He did Fur Fortune and Empire about the fur trade, Leviathan about whaling, Brilliant Beacons about lighthouses, as well as several others. We're very fortunate to have him tonight talking about hurricanes. And before we get started, I do want to make sure I apologize to the audience, because it's been pointed out to me that the last lecture we had in person was about the 1918 pandemic, and then this happened. We schedule one about a hurricane, and we get hit with a storm that the name no one can pronounce. So if anybody's got any suggestions about a book about unicorns, rainbows, or winning lottery tickets, I want to make sure I add that to the thing, because clearly this is on me. So without further ado, would you welcome Eric Dolin?
Thank you. I'm gonna have to share screen, so hang on. I've got to do this. Share screen, advanced portion of screen. Okay, hang on. I need to just go here, slideshow, do presenter tools. Let me just make this a little bit bigger. So almost there. So tell me, do you see the cover of my book?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Anyway.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks for inviting me, Mark. It's a pleasure to be back. I really wish that I was there in person. I love coming to Falmouth to walk around before the talk, maybe grab a bite to eat. And I hope sometime in the future, I'm able to be there in person as opposed to over Zoom. Now, Mark was talking about the timing of this book and the recent hurricane, Isaias, I think is how you say it. It was very funny. I was fortunate enough, this book was reviewed in the New York Times on publication day on August 4th. It's going to be in the actual paper on August 16th. But today I was on the podcast. The editor of the book review section of the New York Times, Pamela Paul, interviewed me about the book. And she started off by saying, I think that you're going to have the record for the best pub date coinciding with an event that helps the book. So maybe it did help the book, maybe it didn't. I feel sorry for the people that were in the path of the hurricane, but we're going to have a very active season. Anyway, oh, wait a second. Oh, there, just make sure advance. Now, writing this book, I came across many dramatic stories, and I'm going to just share a few. One that occurred during the Great Colonial Hurricane of 1635, which hit your part of the world, started on August 14th. There was a vessel called the Watch and Wait that was leaving from Ipswich to head to Marblehead, Massachusetts, my hometown and where I'm speaking to you from now. On board the ship were 23 people, including Anthony Thacker and his wife and 4 of his children. Well, when the hurricane roared in, they were at sea, and the ship was dashed against the rocks of an uninhabited island that was about a mile off of Cape Ann. Only Thacker and his wife survived. Everybody else perished. They managed to make it to shore. They survived for 5 days eating the food that had washed ashore and grabbing some clothes because they were nearly naked. And finally, they were able to signal to a passing ship that picked them up and brought them to the mainland. Now, the Massachusetts legislature, when it heard Thacker's story, it decided in honor, sort of, or compensation for his loss, that they wanted to give him this island. Thacker had called the island Thacker's Woe, but we know it as Thacker's Island, and it's about a mile off of Rockport, and it's part of Rockport, Massachusetts. Then there's this story from the Miami hurricane of 1926, which struck on September 18th. Sorry, I just gotta do this on the side. Okay, great. which struck on September 18th. A few miles north of Miami in Fort Lauderdale, there was a heart-wrenching scene. A couple was in their house when the house collapsed and pinned the husband beneath the rubble. The water was rising. His wife was trying desperately to drag him out, but she was having no luck, so she knelt next to him as the water was rising to hold his head up to keep him from drowning. He begged her to leave, but she refused. But finally, the water got high enough so it was at her shoulders. She gave him a kiss and left, and her husband, of course, died. I'm still getting the hang of this thing. I need to have the cursor in the right place. Then there's this story from a hurricane that many of you no doubt know a lot about, the hurricane of 1938, which slammed into Long Island in New England on September 21st. On that morning, there was a man at the tip of Long Island who was very excited. He had been waiting for a fancy barometer to arrive in the mail, and late that morning it came. He opened up the box and took out this gleaming instrument, and he noticed that it was pointing to a measurement that indicated that a hurricane had already arrived or was going to soon be there. But outside, the sun was shining and the seas were quiet. So believing the barometer to be broken, he wrote the manufacturer an angry note and then drove to the post office to mail it in. He shouldn't have been so rash. By the time he returned from town, the great hurricane of 1938 had blown both his house and his precious barometer away. Now, A Furious Sky contains many more tragic stories like these, but the book is much more than a litany of death and destruction. It also weaves together a great range of captivating themes. There is the intriguing and at times rather contentious history of meteorology, the influence of hurricanes on the course of empire, the outcomes of war, and the fortunes of individuals adds to the story. Critical innovations in communication, aviation, computer, and satellite technology play an important part, as does the women's movement and its role in the naming of hurricanes. In the end, the history of America's hurricanes forces us to confront thorny questions of how we can learn to survive and adapt to the continued barrage that is sure to come from the greatest storms on earth. Hurricanes are an integral, inevitable, and painful part of the American experience. Just as we can count on the sun rising and setting each day, so too we can expect hurricanes to periodically visit our shores. Why is that not? Oh, clicker. If you're among the many tens of millions of people inhabiting the East Coast, the Caribbean, or the Gulf Coast and Hawaii, hurricanes are looming threats that might invade your life. The hurricane season officially runs from June 1st through November 30th. In an average year, 6 hurricanes dance across the Atlantic, 3 of which are major hurricanes defined as having sustained winds of 111 miles per hour or greater. Fortunately, few of these storms actually make landfall. Typically, 2 hurricanes hit the United States annually, and a major one pummels us about once every 2 years. But I've got some bad news for you. Today, Colorado State University, one of the premier forecasting organizations for the hurricane season, upped their already scary predictions for the rest of the season. They predict that there are likely to be 12 hurricanes before we're done with this season, 6 of which are major. And they also estimate that there's a 74% chance that a major hurricane is going to make landfall in the United States. Now, hurricanes are not equal opportunity offenders. While 21 coastal states have been hit by these meteorological behemoths, residents of Florida, Texas, North Carolina, Louisiana, and South Carolina in that order take the brunt of the punishment, with Florida alone accounting for roughly 40% of hurricane strikes. This is disturbing. I'm learning about Zoom. For some reason, my clicker is not working, so I hope that I don't have to keep leaning down. But anyway, hurricanes have left an indelible mark on American history. Since 1980, they have accounted for roughly 50% of the cost of all the natural disasters in the United States that have exceeded $1 billion in damage. And going back to the 1800s, hurricanes have killed nearly 30,000 people. A Furious Sky is the history of the hurricanes that have hit what today is the United States. But before going any further, I need to identify or define a key term. What is a hurricane? Simply put, hurricanes are violent, swirling storms with sustained winds of at least 74 miles per hour. They generally form where the ocean's upper layer, down to about 150 feet, reaches the trigger temperature of 80 degrees Fahrenheit, thereby providing the massive amounts of heat energy necessary to fuel the storm. Two other conditions are necessary for a hurricane to thrive. One is low vertical wind shear, which keeps the hurricane from being ripped apart, and an abundance of warm, moist air that evaporates from the ocean surface. When that moist air rises, it cools and condenses, forming clouds and releasing the latent heat that powers the storm. Hurricanes can be anywhere from tens of miles in diameter to more than 1,000 and over 50,000 feet high. They rotate in a counterclockwise position in the northern hemisphere and clockwise in the southern. They are characterized by extremely low pressure and a relatively calm center called the eye, with the most ferocious winds occurring in the eye wall. Now, many people have attempted to describe hurricanes through the centuries. In 1772, a teenage Alexander Hamilton wrote about a hurricane that barreled into his home island of St. Croix in late August of that year. Good God, what horror and destruction. It seemed as if a total dissolution of nature was taking place. The roaring of the sea and wind, fiery meteors flying about in the air, the prodigious glare of almost perpetual lightning, the crash of the falling houses, and the ear-piercing shrieks of the distressed were sufficient to strike astonishment into the angels. Now, this letter is very interesting because it showed his incredible talent with words. And this letter is part of the reason that a group of wealthy islanders banded together, raised some money to send Alexander Hamilton to New York to pursue higher education. The first European to witness the fury of hurricanes was Christopher Columbus, who survived one on his fourth journey to the New World in 1502. Hurricanes had a significant impact on the course of colonial history. For example, a hurricane in 1609 smashed into the relief convoy sailing to the Jamestown colony in Virginia, causing the lead ship, the Sea Venture, to crash off of Bermuda. It took a year for the castaways to build two small ships and sail to Jamestown. Now, this hurricane left its mark on history by depriving the colony of leadership and supplies during its most trying time, and by creating the circumstances that ultimately led to the castaways' arrival nearly a year later, which provided the starving settlers with the lifeline they needed to survive until the next relief convoy arrived. Two strong hurricanes that swept through the Caribbean in 1780 destroyed numerous British and French ships, killed tens of thousands of people, and greatly affected the course of the American Revolution. Those hurricanes caused the French fleet to decide that staying in the Caribbean during hurricane season was too dangerous. So when the next hurricane season rolled around in 1781, the French sailed north, both to avoid tangling with more hurricanes and to help their allies, the Americans. By following this course of action, the French played a key role in the crucial Battle of the Chesapeake and the ultimate American victory over the British in the Battle of Yorktown, which ended when Lord Charles Cornwallis surrendered to George Washington on October 19th, 1781. And it was a real turning point in the war. Although there were still 2 years to run, this is what started the peace negotiations to get off to a start. Now, of course, hurricanes didn't cease with the founding of the United States, and many hundreds of them have pummeled America's shores over the past 237 years, including the Great September Gale of 1815, which was just a hurricane by another name. It zipped over the tip of Long Island and slammed into New England. The hurricane seared itself into the memory of Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., who was only 7 at the time and would become one of America's most celebrated essayists and poets. Holmes's 1836 poem, titled The September Gale, humorously recounted the passing of the hurricane over his Cambridge home. One of the stanzas in the poem told of the storm's dramatic effect on his wardrobe. It chanced to be our washing day, and all our things were drying. The storm came roaring through the lines and set them all a-flying. I saw the shirts and petticoats go riding off like witches. I lost, bitterly I wept, I lost my Sunday breeches. Now, the Galveston Hurricane of 1900 leveled the city and killed at least 6,000 people, making it the deadliest hurricane in American history. There were so many dead that they couldn't bury all of them, and many of them had to be burned. The Great Miami Hurricane of 1926 killed around 400 people, left 40,000 people homeless, and caused $105 million in damage. The Labor Day Hurricane of 1935 ripped through 3 government work camps located in the Florida Keys, killing hundreds of World War I veterans who were sent there to build a highway all the way down to Key West. Oh, I figured out what it is. Whenever somebody comes into the talk, my clicker has to be reconnected to my computer. That's interesting. I learned something. Anyway, the Labor Day Hurricane of 1935 is still the most intense Category 5 hurricane to hit the United States mainland, with maximum sustained winds of 185 miles per hour and gusts as high as 200 miles an hour or more. Did it again. Well, it's good that people are joining, but I have to keep leaning over. Now, Ernest Hemingway, shown here when he was dashing and young, who lived in Key West at the time, was one of the first responders to help the stricken. After seeing the death and destruction on Lower Matecumbe Key, Hemingway wrote, "The brush was all brown as though autumn had come to these islands, where there is no autumn. But that was because the leaves had all been blown away. The biggest bunch of dead were in the tangled, always green, but now brown mangroves. You found them everywhere, and in the sun, all of them were beginning to be too big for their blue jeans and jackets, that they could never fill when they were on the bum and hungry." The Great Hurricane of 1938 delivered a body blow to New England, resulting in damages of $300 to $400 million, killing 680 people and seriously injuring 2,000, making it the most destructive natural disaster ever to strike the region. The actress Katharine Hepburn was at her family's Victorian summer home at the edge of the water in Old Saybrook, Connecticut, when the hurricane struck. She and 5 other people escaped the house as it was being ripped apart and torn from its foundation, and they sought refuge at a nearby inn on higher ground. Looking back, Hepburn would later recall, "We saw the house slowly turn around, sail off to the northeast, and start down the brook which fed the swamp lagoon. It just sailed away, easy as pie." Later, she called her father in Hartford. When she told him that the house was gone, he responded, "I suppose you didn't have the brains enough to throw in a match before it disappeared. I'm insured for fire." Oops. It's frustrating. There. Hurricane Carol, which struck the eastern tip of Long Island and then plowed into New England in late August of 1954, left 60 people dead and caused nearly $500 million in damage. The most iconic casualty of Hurricane Carol was the steeple on the Old North Church in Boston, which tumbled to the ground. Hurricane Camille in August of 1969 clobbered coastal Mississippi. Of the many people who suffered during Camille, none had a greater burden to bear than Paul Williams Sr., the longtime caretaker at the Trinity Episcopal Church in Pass Christian. The night that Camille came ashore, Paul, his wife, Myrtle, and most of their children chose not to evacuate, but rather to stay in the auditorium attached to the church. The hurricane demolished the auditorium, and in the end, 11 of Paul's children perished, along with one grandchild and his beloved Myrtle. Hurricane Andrew struck Miami on August 24th, 1992. It tore a 30-mile-wide swath of misery through Miami-Dade County. A staggering 126,000 homes were damaged or destroyed, making more than 160,000 people homeless overnight. Total damage approached $27 billion. Zoo Miami was especially hard hit. About 300 rare birds were lost when the zoo's aviary was smashed, and scores of monkeys and baboons escaped from the research and breeding facilities. To shelter the Caribbean flamingos from the hurricane, the staff at the zoo herded them into one of the men's bathrooms, shown here. Hurricanes rarely strike Hawaii, but there have been a few of note, the most memorable being Hurricane Iniki, which made landfall on the Hawaiian island of Kauai in September of 1992. It killed 6 people and caused $3.1 billion worth of damage, setting the tourism industry back for many years. It also forced director Steven Spielberg to cancel the final day of shooting for the film Jurassic Park. Everyone associated with the movie crammed into the ballroom at the Westin Kauai Hotel to take shelter from the storm. And actually, during the height of the storm, Spielberg took some of his cameramen down to the shore to film scenes of the waves crashing into the pier. And those scenes actually made their way into the ultimate movie. Now, the crew survived, and a few weeks later, Spielberg, a cameraman, and a few of the actors filmed one last scene on Oahu, since the film sets on Kauai had been trashed. At the end of August 2005, Hurricane Katrina ravaged parts of Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, costing $125 billion, making it the most expensive hurricane ever to strike the United States. It left about 1,800 people dead in Mississippi and Louisiana, with Louisiana claiming the lion's share. Ground zero for Katrina, however, was the city of New Orleans, which suffered the most devastating blow. Multiple levee failures around New Orleans left 80% of the city submerged. Hundreds of thousands of homes and businesses were inundated. Tens of thousands of people were stranded in their homes, which were filled with or surrounded by a toxic brew of contaminants that one person dubbed hazmat gumbo. 25,000 people took shelter in the Superdome. With no running water, the bathrooms didn't work, and conditions were horrific. It took the better part of a week for a wide range of organizations and individuals to rescue or respond to the many thousands who were trapped in their homes, hospitals, and businesses. It wasn't until Monday, September 5th, that the Army Corps finally closed the last of the levee breaches, and by October, the city was finally drained. 7 years after Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy struck New Jersey and New York on Monday, October 29, 2012, killing more than 150 people and resulting in $65 billion worth of damage. Sandy's waves pounded the shore and crashed into one another with such force that their vibrations were picked up by seismographs nearly 2,500 miles away in Seattle. New York City was particularly hard hit. Many subway lines and automobile tunnels were flooded. At one point, close to 1 million Con Ed customers in and around the city had lost electricity. And the hits just kept on coming. The 2017 hurricane season turned out to be one for the record books. In the end, there were 10 hurricanes, 6 of which were major. 4 of those hurricanes roared ashore. But what really set 2017 apart was that 3 out of the 4 hurricanes that made landfall were Category 4 hurricanes, major ones. Never before had there been 3 Category 4s in a single year. The damage attributed to Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria totaled $265 billion, making 2017 the most expensive hurricane season on record by far. Hurricane Harvey dumped 50 inches of rain in the Houston area and within 48 hours, and it doused a place called Nederland, Texas, with 60.8 inches, a new U.S. record for a single storm. In the Houston area alone, the weight of all of that water caused the crust of the earth to sink nearly an inch. Hurricane Irma maintained winds of 185 miles per hour for an astonishing 35 hours over the open Atlantic, setting a world record for sustained wind intensity. Irma's winds decimated Florida's agricultural sector, and more than 50% of the orange crop was lost. Hurricane Maria made landfall in Puerto Rico as a strong Category 4 with winds of 155 miles per hour. It passed diagonally over the island, dumping up to 3 feet of water in some areas. During its 8-hour transit across Puerto Rico, Maria damaged or obliterated virtually every human-made structure outside of the capital of San Juan and many within the city's limits, and knocked out power to the entire island, leaving its 3.4 million residents in the dark. And they're still working to make their way back from that tragic storm. The death toll for Maria has spawned considerable controversy, with estimates ranging from 1,397 to 4,645. While A Furious Sky details some of the most destructive hurricanes to reach our shores, it also recounts pivotal discoveries over the past 3 centuries in the fields of meteorology, aviation, communications, which have greatly improved our ability to understand, monitor, and report on hurricanes. For example, after studying a hurricane in 1743 that moved from Philadelphia to Boston, Benjamin Franklin became the first person to realize that hurricanes had forward movement, and that a hurricane's winds could blow contrary to the direction in which it was moving. During the Great Storm controversy in the mid-1800s, contentious arguments among professional and amateur meteorologists alike helped develop the basic image of a hurricane as a mass of swirling, moisture-laden winds, the velocity of which greatly increases as one approaches the center of the storm until one enters the calm, clear, and surprisingly beautiful eye. The advent of the telegraph, then the radio, followed by hurricane hunter planes and Earth-orbiting satellites, all contributed mightily to our ability to track hurricanes from inception to dissolution. Such advances, combined with vast improvements in computer-based weather prediction models, along with a barrage of weather reporting, means that we have advanced warnings of a hurricane's strength and the timing of its arrival. There have also been dramatic changes in the way we identify hurricanes. In 1953, the Weather Bureau, the precursor to the National Weather Service, began naming hurricanes after women. This decision angered many who thought it was inappropriate, if not downright insulting, to name hurricanes in this manner, and they asked the Bureau to reconsider. One woman said she would rather have an unnamed hurricane hit her house than a storm named after one of her husband's former girlfriends. The Bureau, however, would not be swayed. It stuck fast to its naming system, making it permanent in 1956. Protests died down, that is, until Roxy Bolton spoke up. Bolton was a vice president of the National Organization for Women. In 1970, she urged the National Weather Service to stop naming hurricanes after women. She was tired of reading and hearing media accounts in which female-named hurricanes were variously described as witches, capricious, furious, bad girls, unladylike, vicious, and treacherous. She said women are human beings and deeply resent being arbitrarily associated with disaster. Bolton offered some alternatives. Hurricanes, she said, could be named after birds, or perhaps U.S. senators, especially since they delight in having streets, bridges, and buildings named after them. She even recommended that hurricanes be called himicanes instead. The service refused to budge. Then during President Carter's administration, U.S. Secretary of Commerce Dr. Juanita Krebs took up the cause. A self-described feminist, Krebs heartily supported Bolton's initiative, and in 1979, gender equality won out over tired bureaucracy. From that point forward, Atlantic tropical storms and hurricanes would be alternately named between male and female. Now, what happens if we have a particularly active hurricane season like we have now? There are only 21 names on that list. So if we have more than 21 tropical storms this year, we're going to have to go to the Greek alphabet. Now, meteorologists have not only been interested in forecasting and naming hurricanes, but for a time at least, they were interested in controlling them. From the late 1940s to the 1980s, there were various government experiments to study whether seeding clouds or hurricanes with silver iodide and dry ice might weaken them. None of those experiments succeeded. Since the mid to late 1900s, many other methods besides cloud seeding have been suggested for controlling and even eliminating hurricanes. Some of the most fanciful ideas include flying an enormous fleet of propeller-driven planes around a hurricane in a clockwise direction to unwind it. They also have thought about towing icebergs from the Arctic to the Caribbean to cool off the water and sap the hurricane of some of its strength. Then there is one of the most popular suggestions of all, which has been resuscitated in recent years at very high levels of government, and that is nuke 'em. Just drop a few nuclear bombs into a hurricane and blow it apart. None of them will work. Now the cycle continues. Every year a new hurricane season unfolds. No matter what an individual hurricane season brings, over time, one thing is certain. The United States will continue to be pummeled by these tremendous storms. And because of global warming, hurricanes of the future will most likely be worse than those of the past. Global warming has already made the impact of hurricanes worse. Because sea level has risen as a result of the thermal expansion of the oceans and the melting of the glaciers. Storm surges associated with hurricanes are higher and more destructive. For example, 100 years ago, the sea level in New York was a foot lower than it is now. So the same storm 100 years ago and now, they're very different impacts. And now it would be a little bit greater. A growing number of studies have found strong evidence linking global warming to increased precipitation during hurricanes. The reason is that warming leads to more evaporation, and warmer air is able to contain higher concentrations of moisture, which can come down as rain. Now, considerable research also predicts that warmer oceans, which provide more heat energy to fuel hurricanes, will make the winds produced by these storms even more powerful. Thus, under warmer conditions that predictions say will be the norm toward the end of this century, it is likely that hurricanes will be stronger and wetter. And unfortunately, there also is a growing body of research that shows that in a warmer world, hurricanes might linger longer. They might travel more slowly. And as a result, whatever winds and precipitation they contain would hang around Pacific areas much longer and cause more devastation. Now, at this moment, nobody can say with absolute certainty exactly how hurricanes will change over time as a result of global warming. Scientists would be the first to admit that there are many unknowns, as well as limitations in data and modeling that make it exceedingly difficult to predict the impact of a warmer world on these massive storms. The mounting scientific consensus, however, that an increase in global warming will likely make future hurricanes worse is not encouraging. But even if global warming causes no difference at all in hurricane behavior, society still has to grapple with a hurricane-filled future. And as more and more people move to the coasts, the potential impact of hurricanes will only increase. As this book was heading into the final stage of production, Hurricane Dorian riveted the nation. Beginning in late August of 2019, Americans watched the round-the-clock coverage of this rapidly intensifying storm as it marched slowly across the Atlantic. Each day, reports became more alarming as Dorian not only grew into a monster Category 5 hurricane, but also appeared to be heading directly for the east coast of the United States. But first in line were the Bahamas, parts of which were utterly destroyed by Dorian, which essentially stalled in place for an excruciating 40 hours before moving on as a Category 2 hurricane. Some models still said that that hurricane was likely to strike the United States, prompting mandatory evacuations from Florida to Virginia. Over the next few days, Dorian hugged the coastline, briefly regaining Category 3 status as it moved over warmer waters, then dropping to Category 1 just before making its only landfall in the United States in Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. After that, Dorian zoomed off in a northeasterly direction, making landfall for a second time in Nova Scotia, where it knocked out power to roughly 400,000 people. While Dorian's impact on the United States was significant, it was virtually nothing compared with what happened to the Bahamas and what might have happened to the United States had the hurricane plowed head-on into the coast, instead of skirting the mainland and clipping North Carolina before sailing off into the Atlantic. This time, America was lucky. But if the history of U.S. hurricanes tells us anything, it is that such luck will not last. Now, I have one more slide that will mean a lot to, I assume, many of the people watching this, if you live in and around Falmouth. This is a picture of me in 1991 during Hurricane Bob. That is one of the cottages or summer homes right next to the bike path where the Woods Hole race goes by in Falmouth. And my wife and I went down there. She was working with the state of Massachusetts at the time on tree-related stuff. And she had been asked to go down there and evaluate some of the devastation that the hurricane caused. So I came along and she shot this picture of me. I have to say that Hawaiian shirt, which I absolutely loved, my wife didn't. And soon after we got married, it disappeared from my life. Anyway, that's the end of my talk. I'm going to get out of share screen here, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm still getting used to this whole Zoom experience, and thank you for listening.
Right. Thank you, Eric. That was great. I will fully admit that science and I are not don't get along well. So I'm the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute would laugh before ever hiring me. So some of my questions are going to be kind of rudimentary, but okay. And remember, if you've got a question, use the chat feature down at the bottom. So if we got some questions about this, I'll ask the obvious one first and foremost. Why did they name him after women? I mean, my mother used to make this rather glib comment about because there's no such thing as hurricanes. But I mean, why women's names?
Well, the word hurricane has nothing to do with her, female. It comes from the words that the natives and the native populations in Central and South America used to call the weather gods, especially the ones that brought down these storms. The Taino Indians called it hurricane. The Mayans called it hunraken. So when Columbus and other Europeans came over, they heard these words, and to their ears, especially English ears, it sounded a little bit like hurricane. But to answer your question, there's a very long part of the book that talks about that, and it's fascinating. I'll tell you it briefly. Back at the turn of from late 1800s to the early 1900s, a guy named Clement Raggy, a meteorologist in Australia, a tall, red-headed, irascible, I think genius, very smart guy, he started naming cyclones, or typhoons, actually, which are just hurricanes by another name in the Southern Hemisphere. He started naming typhoons after Tahitian beauties, as he called them. And he's the first person to name hurricanes after women. He got in a little bit of trouble, not for that so much, but the government took away his funding and most of his funding. So he started naming hurricanes after local politicians and describing them as being very nasty. And he got in even more trouble for that. But so, okay, we fast forward from 1900 to 1941, a book by George Rippey Stewart called Storm became a huge bestseller in the United States. It wasn't about a hurricane. It was about a major storm, tropical storm, that came across the Pacific and was heading towards California. In that book, he has one of the meteorologists names all of the storms after women. So he names this storm Mariah. And, you know, the wind calls Mariah. It's actually a connection. So that book was very, very popular. In fact, it was sent out to the Pacific Theater to GIs who read it. And that's part of the reason that in the Pacific, the American Army and Navy started in the 1940s naming typhoons after women. Well, in the early 1950s, the Weather Bureau started naming hurricanes after the Army-Navy phonetic alphabet, like Abel, Baker, Charlie. There was another phonetic alphabet being used that caused some confusion. So looking back at the example of Clement Raggy, but even more so what George Rippey Stewart did in the book Storm, the Weather Bureau decided to name hurricanes after women. So that's sort of the story. And it was a very different time. Now we're more equal.
Okay. You mentioned about the Great Storm controversy. Explain.
Well, the Great Storm controversy, in a nutshell, takes up a big part of one chapter, but there was an amateur. People didn't know exactly how hurricanes operated, even in the early 1800s to mid-1800s. There was one amateur meteorologist named William Redfield who discovered something very important about hurricanes. His wife died in childbirth, and his son died soon thereafter. So he had to go from Cromwell, Connecticut, where he lived, to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, which is about 70 miles north and a little bit west, to tell his in-laws the horrible news. Now, he was a very perceptive man, self-taught. He noticed something. When he left Cromwell, you got to step back for a second. A hurricane had hit the area a month before, a very powerful hurricane, knocking down numerous trees. In Cromwell, where he started out, he saw that all the trees that were knocked down had their crowns facing in a northwest direction. But as he made it to Stockbridge, which was 70 miles north and a little bit to the west, he noticed something odd. All of the trees that were knocked down there, their crowns were facing to the southeast. So he was thinking, how could this be? It's the same storm. How could winds, such powerful winds, be blowing in opposite directions within such a relatively short space? He concluded, and he based it both on doing research and asking people in the area and also studying hurricanes afterwards, he concluded that they were big whirlwinds. They went in a circle around a central axis. So that was an amazing contribution to understanding how hurricanes operated. He also concluded that in the northern hemisphere, they go in a counterclockwise direction. In the southern hemisphere, they go in a clockwise direction. So he has this image of hurricanes being big circular storms. Another guy named James Espy, who was a professional meteorologist, totally disagreed. He's the guy that discovered that heat rising from the ocean causes the air to rise, and when the moisture condenses, it releases latent heat that powers a hurricane. He also viewed a hurricane as a big heat engine. So as this air rises, it creates a partial vacuum, sort of, and nature abhors a vacuum. So as the air rises in the center of the storm, air from the side rushes in. He thought the winds in the hurricane didn't go in a circle, but they rushed in towards a central point, much like the spokes of a wheel. So there's a basic difference here. One person has a circular image of the hurricane. Another person says, no, it's not really a circle. The winds are rushing in towards the center and then going up. Well, they both died in the late 1850s, going to their grave thinking that their theory was correct, and they each had their own acolytes. Well, it turns out both of them were partially correct. What they didn't understand is the impact of the Coriolis force, which another amateur scientist named William Ferrell applied to meteorology in the mid-19th century. So basically, Redfield was right that hurricanes were big whirlwinds, but they didn't go around in a perfect circle. They actually swirled inwards because the Coriolis effect means that in the northern hemisphere, any wind or object that is moving is pushed slightly to the right. So as wind is rushing into the center of the low pressure of the hurricane, it can't go straight in like Espy thought. It gets pushed to the right and it sort of swirls around. So Espy was right about the power of the hurricane and where it gets its power from, the rising of the moist air and the condensation of the moisture and the release of latent heat. So that is sort of the storm controversy. It maybe doesn't sound that sexy to us right now, but there were major battles fought in the evolving and growing scientific and public press. Espy at one point went around the country to give lectures at lyceums, basically castigating Redfield and saying he was wrong. Redfield was a little more polite, but he and his followers said that Espy was wrong, and it got quite nasty and public. So that's the controversy.
Thank you. And speaking of power, you also mentioned about, which was the storm that, this amazes me, the crust of the earth sunk 1 inch?
Harvey. Well, the crust of the earth is pliable. I mean, it's harder than the molten core, but it's riding on a more molten inner sphere of the earth. So it does get depressed. Mountains depress it. When the glaciers melted, there was a process of the crust sort of lifting up because all that weight was taken away. I don't know exactly how they measured it, but there was some scientists that measured it. But when you had 50 inches of rain falling within a day or two, in some areas 60 inches of rain, that is an incredible amount of weight. And it was all of that weight that caused a deformation in the crust.
Thank you. Some questions coming in. Again, if you got a question, use the chat feature down below. Hurricane Bob was the last major hurricane to hit New England. What chance do we have of being hit again? Is the path of hurricanes generally moving away from New England?
No, on average, over the last couple of 100 years where we have data, there are about 5 to 10 hurricanes a century that hit New England, that make landfall in New England. For example, Hurricane Sandy hit New England, the outer bands of it, but it didn't make landfall in New England, so it doesn't fall into that category. So we do get pummeled by hurricanes every once in a while. Sometimes they come in pulses, like in 1954 and 55, when 3 different hurricanes and 1 tropical storm plowed into New England. Are we going to get another hurricane? Yes. Are we going to get another powerful hurricane like the hurricane of 1938? Yes, depending on how long you live. There is no evidence that we are getting fewer or more hurricanes right now, but there is some science that points to the possibility that with the warming of the oceans, hurricanes might have a better chance of making it further north and being more powerful when they strike. And that makes a lot of sense. And that's part of the reason why the hurricane season that we're in right now is predicted to be so bad and already has exceeded expectations and broken some records. It's because if you look at a thermal map of the Atlantic Ocean right now, it is a lot warmer than the normal average. And many of the people listening to this probably have seen in the newspapers recently reports about some southern fishes being found in New England waters that you normally don't see here. So something is going on. The waters have been warming. Lobsters have been sort of migrating and getting into some trouble because of the warmer waters in Long Island Sound. So things are changing. I can't tell you, and I don't think any scientist could tell you exactly when we're going to get our next hurricane here. I know they can't, or whether we're going to get more in the future. But I firmly believe that certainly within my lifetime, there's going to be another hurricane to remember in New England.
Okay. You got a question from, you got a big fan here in the audience. Eric, I'm a science weather geek, so I've hung in your every comment. Great talk. Tropical storm Isaias was not so much about rain and flooding in New England, but more so about wind gusts and spawn tornadoes. Do you have any comments about the wind damage element, while also recalling we had 3 or 4 tornadoes on the Cape in 2019?
Yeah, there is tornadic activity in hurricanes. I couldn't explain to you the dynamics of it, but tornadoes are not mini hurricanes. They're different beasts. But yes, hurricanes do oftentimes spawn tornadoes. The thing about the wind and the water, most of the deaths that occur from hurricanes come from water, either freshwater flooding areas or waves coming in and drowning people. Something like 8 or 9 out of every 10 deaths are related to the water. However, the wind causes tremendous damage as well, especially in the summer when the leaves are full of trees, and if the ground has been wet prior to the hurricane's arrival, that gives the trees even less purchase. So yeah, wind caused a lot of problems. I think at one point there were 3 million people in the United States with no power because of Isaias. I even looked online how to pronounce it, and I saw it. I can't remember. Isaias, whatever. The wind is a very critical element. Meteorologists are fond of saying you run from the water, but you hide from the wind. And if your house is indeed strong enough, it could stand up to a very powerful hurricane. The problem is, if you get a Category 5 hurricane hitting anywhere, even the best designed buildings are going to suffer. So that's the wild card. It depends how strong the hurricane is, what the conditions on the ground were prior to the hurricane's arrival, and the tides and other factors all mixed together. I mean, Hurricane Sandy was barely a hurricane when it made landfall. It was just on the cusp of 75, 80 miles per hour. But it was pushing before it because it was such a huge storm, enormous storm surges. At one point, they saw a wave off of New York, many miles off New York. It was 32 feet high at one of the buoys. And that's what caused a lot of the damage along the coast. Now, just think, if Hurricane Sandy had been a Category 4 storm, that far north, and that big, I can't imagine what it would have done. So, as I said to the editor of the Times, who I spoke to this morning, she said, you're leaving me depressed, Eric. Do you have any positive words? I said, we're going to get hammered by hurricanes no matter what we do, but we can do a much better job as individuals and as a society preparing for them, dealing with them when they're here, and then mopping up in the aftermath. But those involve very complicated and expensive personal and public policy decisions. And oftentimes, at least at the national and local level, money and planning are in short supply. You're on Cape Cod. Cape Cod is a big, pile of sand, essentially, out into the ocean. You have problems with erosion with nor'easters, or just mild storms, or just erosion and longshore drift is occurring all the time. Imagine if a Category 3 hurricane plowed into, the Cape, right where you are. It's going to cause a lot of damage. So I'm not trying to depress people, but there's nothing we can do to keep them from coming. But you can protect yourself by taking a good look at your house, figuring out whether your shingles are on tight, your roof, and whether you have a go bag maybe if you have to evacuate. Listen to what local meteorologists are telling you, and don't make stupid decisions. Because you can always rebuild a house. You can't come back from the dead.
Good, very good advice. You just referenced Hurricane Sandy. Why do some people refer to it as Superstorm Sandy rather than a hurricane?
Well, very interesting. Hurricane Sandy, when it was ready to hit the coast, it is the first time and only time, to my knowledge, that the National Weather Service, in a hurricane warning and forecast, talked about the possibility of snow. What happened is that there was a very strong a system inland in the United States. Hurricane Sandy was coming this way. There was another storm coming this way. And when they mixed over land, they actually dumped more than 3 feet of snow in some parts of North Carolina and Virginia. And that was the remnants of Hurricane Sandy. So it was a superstorm because it wasn't just a hurricane. It was pulling in a lot of cold air. And the mix between the warm air and the cold air and the way that they were embracing created this quote unquote superstorm that not only generated massive waves at the shore and massive winds, but later on morphed into superstorm, Frankenstorm, whatever you want to call it, that dumped snow over large portions of that were relatively far inland. So it was a very unusual storm. And you said, I just want to say something to make you feel better, Mark.
No,
You said you're not a scientist.
I'm
not a scientist. I'm not a scientist. I have a biology degree undergrad. I actually worked for a summer at Woods Hole with John Teal on the Salt Marsh Project. I was a cook at the Fishmonger Cafe, some of my best memories. I lived on Woods Hole Road. So I have a science background, but I knew nothing about meteorology, basically, other than what I saw on television before I started this book. And the real hardcore science that goes into understanding how hurricanes operate is quite sophisticated. And I have a lot more respect than I did before for meteorologists and the people that are working on helping to protect us from these storms and helping to forecast future weather. So it's the intersection. I do like the intersection of history and science. And I tried to keep the science in the book not only accurate and interesting, but I tried not to overwhelm the reader with too much arcania and too much science, so they might drift off. So hopefully there's just enough science in there.
How long did it take you to research this, and how did you research it?
Almost every book I write takes about 18 to 20 months for me to research and write. And then I have a period where I have internal reviewers review it before I give it to my publisher. So the whole process from starting to research to giving it to my publisher is about 2 years. The way that I do it generally, the beginning stages are often both a lot of fun, but also a little nerve-wracking, because I quickly realize, since a lot of my books cover many centuries and are popular topics, that there's a vast array of information that I can pull from. There are way more books, articles, diaries, newspaper accounts than I could possibly read. So the first thing that I do is I try to read what I perceive to be the classics in the field, very important books that talk about the subject that I'm writing about. Those books tend to give me a broad structural framework or skeleton to understand what I'm writing about. And then I have an outline which maps out which hurricanes I was going to talk about, what other things I was going to wrap into the discussion. And then when I go chapter to chapter and I need to drill down on a specific hurricane, like the hurricane of 1938 or the Galveston Hurricane of 1900, then I go more deeply and I just look for what I perceive to be, and it's a subjective choice, the most reputable, persuasive, and to me valuable sources. But it's always making decisions about what not to read just as much as it is making decisions about what to read. Because with hurricanes, they're literally, I could have been reading for 20 years and now I'm not gotten through all the literature. But I want to write a book, I need to earn a living, I want to write a book, and I get bored after 20 years. So it's a lot of decision making, and I've gotten better at it over time. This is my 14th book. And in addition, I have a PhD, so I spent many years doing hardcore research on one little topic, and that honed some of my skills in library research and separating, as they say, the wheat from the chaff. I know very quickly when I'm reading a source, especially as I get deeper into the project, whether this is going to be of value to me or not. So that's sort of a long answer how I do it. There's a little bit of panic along the way. I often, I do. I don't know about other writers, and I've talked to many other writers. There are many times during the process that I feel sort of overwhelmed, but the nicest thing or the most pleasant feeling usually happens about 8 months after I start researching a book. I get to the point where I've read so much, I've taken so many notes, and I have such a grasp of the material that suddenly it feels almost like second nature, and the interconnections and the trajectory of the entire book become very clear to me. Even though I already had an outline which painted the trajectory, it's usually 8 months in or 10 months in where I have a relative mastery of the material that gives me the confidence to actually write the book. And writing a book is an iterative process as well. I don't just write 1 chapter, 2, 3, 4, and then forget about everything before. I go from the beginning to end, but if I find new information 3 months later that pertains to something 3 chapters ago, I go back and I change it, and it has a ripple effect through the rest of the book.
Well, thank you very much for joining us tonight. I greatly appreciate this. I want to thank everybody for joining us. I want you can finally leave Gloucester now. You can go. You're going to Scituate, you said. So you can.
Yes.
You've made parole. You can come up. But your assignment next time we get together, I want you to, and hopefully not spending 18 to 24 months, I want you to come up with a book on like how to win mega bucks, because so we need to change our role here.
Okay.
So, but Eric, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Great luck with this book. Not that you need luck. You're going to do this. This is going to be great. Thank you everybody for joining us. I stay safe, and again, we'll see you next week. Thank you, Eric.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Let me see.